Climb into the cockpit with pilot and Link Square's Chief Legal Officer, Tim Perilla, as he invites legal leaders aboard to share advice that will help you navigate even the most turbulent times of in-house counsel work. We'll cover a range of topics from data privacy to legal team structure to public company transactions and beyond. You don't want to miss this series. Fasten your seatbelt and prepare for takeoff. You're listening to Cockpit Counsel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cockpit Counsel. My name is Tim. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Link Squares, and as always, we have our producer, Alyssa Verzino. Today, Krista Russell is joining us, who works at Airbus OneWeb Satellites and also is a professor at University of Miami School of Law. Krista, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So we start out every episode the same way. What is your pre-flight ritual?
All right. I was ready for this question.
All right.
I did my research. Since I was little, always step on the plane with the right foot. And anybody that's traveling with me, step on the plane with the right foot. It's not something that I made up in answer to this question. It's what I do every time. And if I'm traveling not for work, I like to have a glass of champagne before I get on the plane as well.
Nice. That's awesome. Any particular reason why the right foot and not the left?
No, I don't know how it started, but since I was young, my family traveled a lot, a reasonable amount when I was younger. So I was on planes a lot, and I did it once, and then I have always kept with it. And now, like, my children know, they get on a plane right foot. My youngest might have learned right and left from getting on planes.
That's incredible. How many kids do you have?
Oh, you weren't ready for this question. Seven.
Oh,
so I have
my
three.
goodness.
My husband has four. We have seven blended, and most of the time have six in our house.
My goodness, that has to be a very busy household.
Yep, it's a circus for sure.
Well, very cool. So let's talk a little bit about Airbus OneWeb Satellites. What can you tell us about the company, and what can you tell us about your role there?
Yeah, sure. So Airbus OneWeb Satellites is a joint venture between Airbus, the aerospace engineering manufacturing company, and OneWeb, which is a telecoms company. And our joint venture was created for the purpose of designing and mass manufacturing low Earth orbit telecommunications satellites. We're slowly kind of expanding, perhaps beyond what that mission might be. But that's what we've historically done and what we do now in production. We have a manufacturing facility right here in Florida, where my office is located down on the Space Coast, and an office in Toulouse, France as well. So we have team members on both sides of the pond. My job when I came into the company was as an associate general counsel. I manage the transactional activities of our entire supply chain. So we have a monosource supply chain. So there's a lot of effort into supply chain sustainability and maintenance, obviously initial contracting and any revisions or changes to those contracts, and anything on the active steady state management side as well. That's more or less still 75% what I do. I've moved into a deputy GC role now, so my scope is a little bit more broad now, and I handle some other general corporate matters. But for the large part, my focus and that of my team, it's a pretty small team, is on the transactional activities through our supply chain as we move from what initially was like a one customer environment to now a multiple customer, multiple program environment.
That's awesome. How big is your legal team?
It's pretty small. We have 11 members of our legal department, but there are only 4 attorneys.
Oh, that's cool. What are the other 7 folks doing?
So we have a lot that work in compliance, export control, generally because we are a multinational company and we're working in a yet to be super regulated, but anticipating more and more regulations coming in the space industry. Plus managing, our supply chain, which works, I think we're in 17 different countries, our suppliers right now. So kind of managing local rules, regulations, ordinances, things as well.
Very cool. So as far as the emerging regulatory environment, and feel free to get into whatever level of detail you can or cannot get into. It's always an area of interest for me. I was at DraftKings for 7 years, and the government affairs work that the daily fantasy sports companies did together as an industry is always really fascinating. And so I'm interested to hear if there's sort of industry groups that you all are working with to help influence some of that regulation and how that's going.
Yeah, so at our joint venture, we are largely just focused on manufacturing, producing for our customers, but there is a high level involvement of that kind of like coalition of companies that are working to advance, lobbying and other parts of government regulation in how space will be managed. There's a lot of competing interests. It's a high capital industry and a lot of barriers to entry because of that. So there's a lot of thoughts about, like making space accessible to everybody, but also, making it in a way that is mindful that it's as big and open as space is by definition, that we can't have a million things flying up in the sky without some sort of general standards for both orbiting and deorbiting, as well as space junk and everything else. So yeah, that's a very big part of the overall industry, is the collaboration with other companies and trying to influence how that looks. Yeah, we're just much more narrowly focused at our JV.
That's an incredibly complicated topic, right?
It is. It's exciting and scary at the same time because of the potential consequences of failing to do it correctly, or perhaps being not mindful. But that is probably as true for any other industry as well. It's just space is so new in the grand scheme of time, to us and accessible to us, that it can feel more consequential.
The position sounds absolutely fascinating. How did you get to where you are? Tell us a little bit about your career path.
Yeah, it's funny that you asked this question today in particular. Last night, so I went to University of Central Florida. I live in Orlando now, but I went to a couple other places before I kind of boomeranged back here. And UCF was actually founded with a mission in the 1960s of providing engineers, scientists, technological specialists for NASA and the Kennedy Space Center, which is, just an hour down the road. And I took my kids to the first home opener of the football game last night. It's the first game, as UCF is a Big 12 member now. So it's a big deal for UCF alumni. And there's space murals and references to Space U, which is like a moniker that UCF sometimes goes by, everywhere. And so my kids are like, Mom, you went to UCF and you're a space lawyer, which I always say is like the coolest hashtag I've ever been associated with, space lawyer.
So lucky. I wish I had that.
Yeah, right. And I'm like, my daughter, who is very curious and a very good conversationalist, even though she's very young, is like, did you know you were going to be a space lawyer when you went to UCF? Which I thought was a very good question. And no, it was not by design. I had no idea when I went to UCF that that's what its purpose was for. And as it just turned out, I ended up being a lawyer through UCF and then subsequently through law school. And now I work in the space, industry. So all of that to say, no, it was not by design. I have been a supply chain lawyer my entire career so far. I've worked in-house for my almost 15 years of practice exclusively in various industries. I've worked in real estate. I've worked for Broadway for a number of years. I worked for FedEx Logistics for a large chunk of my career prior to arriving at Airbus OneWeb Satellites. And I got to AOS through great chance. I was ready to make a move from FedEx. I had been there for quite some time, and I was really trying to get back to Florida. I had young kids. I know you guys are up in Boston. Yeah. I despise all things winter. I always joke that I don't travel north in a month that ends in an R. Because I just don't like the cold. And I was trying to get back here, and it was just a perfect alignment of time and opportunity where this the position arose at AOS, and it just fit perfect with the beginning of the COVID pandemic. I was hired shortly before that. There was a relocation plan. Florida was like wide open during the pandemic, so it was easy to get here. I like found a house online, and it was all it just worked out really great. And so yeah, it's really through my focus on supply chain and transactional work that led me to AOS.
Very cool. Very cool. So, and as far as your professor role at Miami, how did you fall into that?
LinkedIn, to be honest with you. I have a pretty big platform on LinkedIn. I have been using LinkedIn since the beginning of the pandemic just to talk about in-house practice or general topics that come up for, lawyers. I talk about lawyer mom life and like whether being a lawyer makes me a better mom or being a mom makes me a better lawyer. And I just kind of started being quite vocal on the platform, and someone reached out to me and said, hey, there's this position at Miami Law. They're looking for someone who loves that like intersection of business and law, and that can teach the practical side of lawyering and practicing to its law students. It's a one-of-a-kind program in the country, a transactional skills department, whereby the entire focus, it's a 2-year focus for the second and third year of law school, is on the actual practice of law and not necessarily the thinking like a lawyer part that is traditionally focused on.
That's awesome, and very fitting for our episode today, talking about skills that you didn't learn in law school. Tell us a little bit about the content of the programming there at University of Miami, and what are some of your key tips, favorite things to talk about?
Yeah, so the program, it's comprised of several different courses. Generally speaking, there are 3 primary courses: transactional skills 1, 2, and 3. One focuses on everything you need to know about the contents of a contract and then drafting and negotiating, contracts. The second course is an M&A focused class, whereby the entire semester you're going through an M&A transaction, everything from due diligence all the way through closing out the deal. And the third one is like everything else that could tangentially touch on transactional skills work. I have chose to stay in the transactional skills 1 class because I really love it's more students, it's a slightly bigger classes, and I love just kind of having that impression. I take a very different approach to teaching a very set class. I really like being a very real professor. I always tell my students, like, adjuncts they're different than academia professors, your tenured professors that are coming in and they're teaching you by the book and they're teaching you the rules. Like, I like teaching a class that has no rules, right? There's better ways to draft things. There might be preferences in how you negotiate things. You might have a memo that you need to write for a partner or a senior associate that wants it this way and formatted this way, and they don't want any fluff in it. And you might, at your next job or next week for a different partner, have to write it a completely different way. So I try to teach the class entirely with very few rules and a lot of stylistic learnings and teachings that kind of help students take risks in developing their own style, and then eventually learn the flexibility and adaptability to be able to, make that work for whomever they're writing for.
I talk a lot about how I view the practice of in-house law as distinct of a practice area as litigation is from drafting patent applications and prosecuting patents. It's absolutely a different skill set, and that business side of it, and that ability to be flexible in the way that you approach a problem is very, very distinct, and it's something I don't think you can find anywhere. Like, you're never going to find the same mentality at a law firm, right? And thinking about, like, yes, I think you've got to be a good lawyer, right? It's sort of the bar is like, you have to have solid legal skills. You have to be able to think like a lawyer really well, and you have to be able to actually articulate positions effectively. But there's so much more beyond it, right? And once you start to get into the understanding of the business implications of what's going on, a lot of the things that people deem to be, maybe more risky approaches or things like that actually become a lot less risky in the grand scheme of the business, right?
I couldn't agree more. And I use almost that exact line in telling my students, like, how I spend my time when I'm negotiating contracts is probably 80% on the commercial stuff and 20% on my standard legal terms and conditions, your indemnification, your boilerplate stuff. Because when you draft well scope of work and services and how pricing works and what happens when one party doesn't do one thing, not the legal stuff, when you draft the rest of the commercial deal well, usually you don't have to get to the rest of the legal terms. So much of it is beyond the base skills. Like you're not spending your time negotiating the words on a limitations of liability clause. Not usually. Most of my time is writing out all of the ways that the limitation of liability clause might come into effect, and what are the beyond the very small box of breach of contract, right? Like, right. You have to really, really think. My questioning process in my students, and like we go through these exercises at the beginning of every class. It's just something I put together that is, it's two questions. What's the worst that could happen? And then what, right? Like, so just continuing to push down. So when everyone's going to talk, if I programmed into, Google or even ChatGPT now, like, what is the best, what is the skill necessary for in-house counsel? And it's always gonna be like having an understanding of the business. Well, what does that mean, right? How do you develop that understanding of the business? And it's so much more than just the words understanding the business. It's understanding margins and cash flow and how your product is made and who your suppliers are and who your competition is, and having an understanding of your market share within the industry and how all of those pieces come together to form the widgets that you make or the services that you sell. And then thinking from the litigation side, right? Like if you were hit with a lawsuit today for your company not providing the services or manufacturing the goods correctly, like what would that lawsuit be for? What could go wrong? And then just kind of deep diving that. So when you come back to drafting, you come back to negotiating, you can craft an instrument, a contract vehicle that actually considers the actual consequences that could come from it. It's not just saying we will provide 45 hours of engineering services, right? Like you're going beyond that and you're writing it out in a way that it's quantifiable and measurable.
More often than not, when I think about entering a contract negotiation, I'll give on just about anything if the other side can put into context why that's important for their business and the future of their business.
Yep.
Right.
Same.
And it's like, okay, I get it. Like, I get what you're saying, and it can't be like, oh, there's a data breach, and so unlimited liability because our company would go to zero. Like, that's not a meaningful, why is this important to your company? That's like, you read that on the internet somewhere, right?
Right. Or, I mean, by asking that question, Tim, and, kind of having them quantify what the concern is, if you can't accept it just as they proposed it, you can certainly create responsive language or reduce the scope of whatever, the clauses that they want to include or change the red line to address that specific need and not anything else, right? And not to let it be some kind of ticking time bomb in the closet that has a scope much beyond what the actual concern is.
Exactly. And, you think about like being able to articulate what that concern is it's really essential. And if you take it out of the context of the contract, it's great. And, I'll give an example from DraftKings. We had a logo on the Nesson Sports Network, right? The sports network that broadcasts all the Red Sox games. And we wanted to have our logo in like the strike zone thing, right?
Yeah.
Like but we didn't want to have it in like the first inning or the ninth inning. Right. We wanted to have it at parts of the games where people are not like still getting home from work, or if the game happens to be a blowout, people have turned on, whatever, America's Got Talent or something like that. Right. So we wanted it in the bulk of the game, like the real, like critical innings of the game. And, there were aspects of like, oh, there's creative control that we can't really influence, and the broadcast needs to look like this and look like that, blah, blah, blah. And so we eventually had the business people and the lawyers on the phone. And it's just like, listen, what are we trying to do here? Like, what are we trying to avoid? And it really ended up coming down to like, okay, we can do something better than at some point during the game, this will happen, to let's just put it, in a relatively static location. And like we had a range, and it ended up being that the folks who were putting together the broadcast ended up putting our logo up in the exact same inning every single game that season.
And that's that asking that question, right? And like just kind of getting to that had no negative effect for your relationship, for the company, for the other side, but it made the spend that you were, going to utilize to have that buy is so much more valuable than it would have been for spending the same amount of money without that qualification. It's brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just through conversations, and a lot is revealed when you actually reduce things to writing. And so being able to actually like get to a real problem statement through drafting, I think is just as important of a role for the lawyers to play in the transaction as it is getting all of the other language right. It's highlighting those problems to the business people and be like, this isn't a legal issue, right? It's not a legal issue whatsoever. It's you business people haven't decided on this thing. You should probably talk to each other and figure it out. Here's what my suggestion would be, but your call. That sort of
And there's a lot of work that in-house counsel has to do to kind of earn that credibility and that seat at the table, right? Like when we move in-house, you mentioned earlier, like in-house practice is its own beast, really. And it is. And there's a big shift from the mindset of like being a legal expert and coming in with, the subject matter expert on the law to business strategy, which is what in-house practice is. It is not the same kind of practice as private practice with a more, family-friendly schedule. It's much more than that. You are actually, and I bill myself as this as part of my personal branding, but it's also part of the reputation that I think I've earned at this point, which is I'm a business person that has legal background. I put myself out to my colleagues, to my suppliers and opposing counsel as a business person who happens to have this subject matter expertise in law and transactional practice, because that's where I offer the most value. I actually think my business brain is at this point definitely better than my legal brain, but they work cohesively really well together. And to practice at the top of your license in-house, you really have to develop those skills. You have to develop the business acumen, not just as a buzzword on your resume, but you actually have to learn business. You have to learn how to read quarterly earnings statements. You have to learn how to understand earnings calls. You have to be able to, manage and understand your own business's, financial struggles and hurdles and what cash means in your business, the cost of money. It goes beyond the buzzword of having strong business acumen. It actually has to have some substance behind it. And that's really the skills and the kind of thinking that I try to teach in my, law school classes, but also try to embrace and empower my team to kind of think of, so that our business proactively comes to us as a resource, so that they want us in their sales meetings. They want to bring legal along as their business partner, not as this check the box process they have to go through before a deal gets done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a meaningful difference between being a business-oriented attorney and being a leader of of what truly is a business function, which is the legal function, who happens to have some specialty, that is as distinct as marketing is from product or something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about wellness in the workplace. I know you touched on it, like, just like law firm, but with different, more family-friendly hours. Can you talk a little bit about whether it's at either anything you address at school, like in at Miami, or at Airbus, OneWeb? How do you think about wellness in the workplace?
I definitely get questions from my students on this because they know my background of practicing only in-house and my very unapologetic statement of I went to law school with the intention of never spending a day in a law firm, which I have held to this day, except for some settlement conferences and other things like that. So I get a lot of questions. I do about, they're usually what you would expect, like, is work-life balance possible? And, can you be a mom and have like a good legal career? And how do you balance those kinds of things? So I will tell you what I tell my students and what I try to embody in my workplace, which is probably easier than most because we have a multinational culture, and French culture is much more focused on hours and much more vacation and maternity leave and everything else friendly than our U.S. companies.
Yeah,
it's a little bit easier.
What work did you get done with your French counterparts in August?
None.
Yeah.
May, August, there's not working days for France.
The company
they take
I
the law
worked
firm
for.
approach to August, right? Like usually law firms are pretty much, it's hard to find, lawyers in August in the United States.
Yeah.
It's hard to find people in France in August.
Yeah. One of the companies I worked for before DraftKings was purchased by a French gaming conglomerate, and that was a pretty eye-opening experience as I was trying to get the attention of the general counsel's office in France during the month of August. It was like, this is a really important business thing that you should be paying attention to. Silence.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Right. There's
Nothing.
no out of office responses because everybody is out of office.
Just
I
okay.
continue to say to my company, for 2 of the last 4 years, we have had these massive, basically GC department led initiatives that had they impacted our ability to reach our company's goals and objectives and eventually all of our bonuses. And they're always in August. I'm like, we know that nobody is working in August. Like, can we shift this to a different month? Like, this seems like a trick, but anyway, what I tell, my students and anyone who really will listen to me on this topic is, you can have it all. You just have to define what it all means to you. It doesn't have to be what somebody else defines as, work-life balance or, success in having it all. I wasn't planning on saying this, but I wrote a book with some other female lawyers last year that was just called Women in Law, and it was defining what success means to each one of us. And the message in the story really was, through these 20-some different stories of female lawyers, like, you define your own strategy and your own goal, what success means, and or what work-life balance means, or what being an involved mom and having a badass career means. Like, you define it, and then you get to set the parameters and the quantifiable steps that you take to have it. So for me, it's mental wellness and health in the workplace. I authentically show up myself, and I'm only trying to achieve my goals. I'm not trying, and I don't mean only like in a limiting way. I mean, I'm just not measuring myself by society's definition of work-life balance, or what a good mom is, or what having a stellar career is. I set my own expectations for myself, and I manage myself to those standards. And I think we all have the ability to do that. There's more pressure early in our careers because we just spent a lot of money on law school. We have to start making money. We want to take certain steps to get us to the next level. But at the end of the day, really what I have learned is I need to define what that is to me, and who cares what anybody else, if they think that that's success or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important part. And, for me, my view of, what is work-life balance and the importance of that has changed over the years. I do think that there's an aspect of, of rigor that comes with those first couple of years. I like you, have been fortunate enough to never have to work for a law firm. But that being said, what that forced me to do was really be extremely proactive in seeking out development opportunities early on in my career. And that was something, actually, most of my development opportunities, my very first job, I worked for I worked for the CFO. And I worked closely with the finance team, and I was a finance undergrad, which was good, so I could kind of speak the language a little bit. But really, getting an understanding of the business through them and how important that was. And every time I had some sort of a legal issue that I had to talk to them about, it was always, well, how does this filter through my lens as the CFO, or or any other member of the executive team, whatever it may be. But what that did for me is forced me to do a lot, like undertake my own diligence to become good at this, that, and the next thing. We worked with some outside law firm. I was the first in-house attorney for the company. I had no idea what I was doing. And we had a couple of law firms that we worked with, like some pretty good, like AmLaw, like top 50 law firms that we worked with. And so I just asked my boss, hey, is it all right if I talk to these people? I want to learn more about this, learn more about that. And it was a lot of late nights. It was a lot of late nights and a lot of like, no, I can't go out with my friends, or, whatever else I wanted to do on the personal side. And I do think there's an aspect where, depending on where you want your career trajectory to go, no one's going to take you there, right? You've got to define that on your own, and you have to determine, okay, can I still have some level of satisfaction from a work-life balance perspective, and, achieve realistically what I want from a work perspective? And I think it just becomes a sliding scale. It depends what really is going to motivate you at the time. Now, don't get me wrong, like taking vacation, really important. Maybe taking off a Monday or a Friday or a half day Friday, particularly during the summer, like that can do a lot for your mental health if you're pushing yourself to work 12-hour days because you want to learn stuff and you want to advance, right?
Yeah, I agree. And we have a little bit of overlap of our stories there, which I didn't realize. I similarly, I knew that because I was choosing a more narrow path of pursuing my in-house career, that I had to work my tail off in a different way. But I also had to be willing to step outside, and I don't know if this is at all true for you, but I had to step outside of the normal definition of what you're supposed to do your 1L, 2L summers or right after law school. And I've never actually said it this succinctly or out loud before, so this probably comes as a surprise to some people that have followed my journey. I took 2 jobs, one in and right after law school, that were not lawyer roles, that I turned into lawyer roles with time and effort. And I took business roles that gave me exposure to contracts, that gave me exposure to how business worked. One of those companies, I worked for Broadway theaters, like I said, and I was in a job that required me to buy products for less money and sell them for more. That was basically the high and low of what my job was. I was doing the contracts for those things too, but that was more incidental to the role and not necessarily the bottom function of it. And as part of that, I took, like, from a manufacturer we were using in, I think, northwestern Pennsylvania, we did this entire project. I went and spent weeks in Ningbo, China, learning sourcing and manufacturing and everything that turned me into the supply chain lawyer that I am when I was completely outside of a quote unquote legal role. I was really doing like a business affairs kind of role that had a legal component, and that gave me opportunity, understanding that, like we talked about earlier, of what business and supply chain looks like. And, everything from, QA at the end of the process and shipping and customs and freight forwarding and all of those different parts of the business that I then took to my next position, and I was able to not only understand how it worked, but then properly, contract and negotiate for those contracts. So there is a little bit about, the rigor comes out, maybe not just in long hours. That's definitely a part of it, but it's also in kind of setting the expectation for yourself that it might not be the same path that everyone else takes, and not having the ego to let that stop you, like in the pursuit.
Yeah, absolutely. I love hearing people's stories who have a non-traditional path throughout their career. It's something that I think all law students should be open to. It's an incredible way to actually make you a more dynamic professional.
And we have to do good as like experienced professionals at accepting those paths too. Just exactly. Like 30 years ago, I think we're seeing like 90% of general counsels or CLOs are coming from big law practice, right? They're coming straight from 20 years of big law practice into GC roles in companies, because that's what we used to value, as corporations and companies. We thought that was the key in, and a lot of that came from relationships, of course, but most of it was intentional design. That's changing now. I think I read a statistic last year that was somewhat only 30% of GCs were direct from big law or comfortable mid-sized law firms into a GC role. And now we're really breeding in-house lawyers of its own thing. So we have to recognize as in-house lawyers, one, the path has changed, and we have to value that. And we have to recognize other people's paths to in-house. If we want the business strategist, we have to stop looking at the GPA on a resume, seeing what tier of law school you came from and who you did your summer internship with. Like, it has to be more than that. That's our obligation.
Absolutely. And I think it's also reflective of changing expectations from the executive, from the other executive functions now. It's not enough to just be a lawyer, and that's what you get with a lot of big firm lawyers who come in-house. They start out as literally being just a lawyer, and if your executive is expecting someone who's not just a lawyer and gets just a lawyer, it's a pretty rude awakening. And I think that's been the impetus for that, like that opening of alternative career paths to in-house work. So I know, Alyssa, you've got a handful of things too on your end here.
I do, yeah. So we do some like rapid fire questions at the end. So the first one is, what is your hot take about working in-house?
Hot take, get out of your own way. What I mean by that, I tell my students, I would love to be like the Oprah of therapists for people in my life. Like, you get a therapist, you get a therapist, you get a therapist instead of a car. Do your work on yourself, right? Like, the thing that holds us back as in-house counsel and just as lawyers generally is our own ego, our pride, our emotions, our reactivity. Like, you can't practice authentically. You can't be at the top of your game if you're in your own way. Figure out what makes you tick, your triggers, what things are going to annoy you in a negotiation that are going to cause you to feel like you have to win on a certain issue instead of in the greater scheme of things. Get out of your own way.
That's a great answer. The next one was, what's your number one wellness tip? I have a feeling you're going to say, get a therapist.
I mean, it works for many people. Listen, wellness is, part of that is a combination of what I said earlier, truly figuring out what it is that you want. Like, is your personal, success measuring stick dependent on someone else's opinion of you? And you can find that out through therapy. But like, really just kind of figuring that out. So you can't be well and you can't practice wellness without understanding yourself. So, I mean, kind of everything from figuring out who you are to what makes you tick, to what you're passionate about, to kind of the things that are impediments to you achieving them, I think is all critical.
Nice. Another one, how about, what is your number one conflict resolution strategy that you teach your students?
I don't teach much on conflict resolution, but I think I tangentially get it as things, come up. I'm really, really big on, this is like two sides of the same coin, but I think you'll understand what I mean. One, face-to-face time, whether that, it could be computer to computer time, but like just actually talking to people as much as possible. On the other side, I despise meetings for the sake of meetings or extended meetings when something can be done in 30 minutes and not just scheduling an hour. So I'm really big on just putting in the time with our colleagues. If we have one-on-ones regularly scheduled with my various teammates, like if we get there and we get on the call and we don't have anything to talk about, we're not going to waste 30 minutes, right? Let's get back to what our business is, or maybe we'll even preemptively cancel. But I think the more time that we spend with each other, the better. It's kind of like the dinner table. Like we all, you go to restaurants and you see people, they're just on their phones the entire time and we're not actually engaging in conversation. I'm really big on just transparent communication as it pertains to preventing problems as well as solving them.
Great. That was awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, guys.
All right. Well, Krista, really appreciate you joining us today. It was an awesome conversation. And we're going to have to do this again. Maybe Alyssa and I fly down to Orlando, and we can come do that.
Today begins the month that ends in R, so I guess you're not going to be getting me up there.
That's exactly right. We don't
I'd
like-
love to have you down here. I think a tour of our facility, something like that, and let's have another conversation. This is fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Krista. Really appreciate the time. If you like this episode, give us a like, subscribe, follow us on all the socials, and we will see you next time.